Welcome, welcome, everybody. Oh, Georgia, I forgot to mention if you would also record this if you are able to, when you're able, you're already doing it. She's amazing. Our tech person is great, everybody. Welcome. I know that others will continue coming in. So if you could just point folk to, oh, there's lots of open space over here and into the balcony and things like that. Thank you. It is my joy to welcome all of you to First Congregational United Church of Christ. My name is Sharon Benton, and I am the pastor here, but it is four congregations who have come together tonight to make this evening happen. First Congregational UCC, Garden Street United Methodist Church, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and Christ the Servant Lutheran Church. I want to say a huge thank you. Each of these congregations came together to do the volunteering to make tonight happen. And so for all of you who volunteered, so much gratitude. But you don't need to be part of a faith community in order to be a part of this conversation. One of the things that we say each time we come together like this is no matter who you are and no matter where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. You're a beloved child of God. And you are here tonight to hear Reverend Adam Russell Taylor. Reverend Taylor is president of Sojourners and author of A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building the beloved community. He's been part of many ministries and justice organizations continually striving for the growth of God's shalom, God's realm, God's beloved community here on earth. It's also a joy to welcome him back to this congregation because he spent a few years of his youth as part of it. And we love that he remains connected to us. It is such a joy. And so I welcome you. Come on up, Adam.
Good evening. It truly is a joy to be back in Bellingham, and it is a particular joy to be in this church. I want to thank Reverend Benton and for all the other co-sponsoring churches for making this night possible. And I'm just honored to be with you tonight, to have a chance to reflect on where we find ourselves as a country, and where, most importantly, do we go from here? And if you saw some of the publicity, I did tag a title onto this talk tonight, which is Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or the Beloved Community? Now, I have the privilege of leading an organization called Sojourners that is based in Washington, D.C., but has a national and in some ways global ministry. How many of you are familiar with Sojourners? Any? All right, I'd love to see all the hands. So lots of friends in the house tonight. If you didn't raise your hand, we are an ecumenical Christian organization that has a publication arm, and you can actually get some copies of our magazine outside. We have the physical magazine, but we also have a digital publication that you can access for free at sojo.net, and we write about the intersection of faith, politics, and culture, all through a lens of trying to equip and inspire Christians of all backgrounds and traditions to put their faith into action for justice and peace. And we also have a mobilizing and action arm called Sojo Action that has a number of different campaigns that you can learn more about. Now, as Reverend Benton mentioned, this church was extremely formative for me between the age of about 10 to 16 years old. It literally is the one church where my family was the most active, and my parents, Kit and Sonny, really wanted to be here tonight, and they share their love to all of you that know my parents. My dad was active in the folk choir. My mom supported the young adult ministry. And I have extremely fond memories of something I was involved in called the Joy Jesters. I'm assuming that's still around, I hope. And two of my dear friends from this church, Craig and Ellen, I want to really dedicate these remarks to Ellen, who we lost. And I really believe that you'd be smiling about this moment right now. I want to share a little bit about my origin story because it is woven into what we're going to discuss tonight. My parents ended up in Bellingham in a very providential way from my perspective. My father, Kit, and my mother, Sonny, met in a PhD program at Ohio University in the mid-1960s. And they fell in love, and that was frowned upon. It was controversial, because my mother is African American, my father is white. And they ended up getting together and breaking up and getting together and breaking up. Finally, my mom went back to Louisville, where she is from. Just a little kind of tidbit about my mom. She grew up with Cassius Clay, who later became Muhammad Ali. They both went to Central High School, and in his autobiography, he talks about having a crush on Sandra Lawson, which is my mother's maiden name. So things could have gone in a very different direction. But my parents were in love, and yet had a hard time figuring out how to be together. And so my dad was in Ohio, and he was in a diner, and the placemat was a map of the United States. And he started thinking about where could they start a life together where racism wouldn't be the dominant force in their life. And no offense if you're from any of these states, but he just started crossing out states where he didn't think it was going to work. So the South was gone, the Midwest was gone, and he literally ended up with just 3 states: the state of California, the state of Colorado, and the state of Washington. And so he started sending out applications to those states, and the first university that invited him to interview was Western Washington University. So my dad goes out, he got a PhD in psychology, has a great interview, and they offer him a professorship on the spot. Now, to this day, I don't know how my dad did this. I mean, first of all, that in itself was kind of a mini miracle, but then he basically said, I cannot take this professorship unless you find a position in your counseling department for Sandra Lawson. So he negotiates a job for my mom without even having her resume. Western somehow agrees. He calls my mom up and is like, you wouldn't believe how beautiful it is in this place. We need to start a life together here. And mom was like, what are you talking about? Hadn't talked for a number of weeks, weren't together, and he literally says, I don't want to propose with the phone, but I just believe this is where we are meant to be. And so, in a sense, the rest is history. They moved to Bellingham. A couple years later, had my older brother, and then a couple years later after that, had me. And I had an amazing childhood here. Now, another part of the story that's kind of important is the reason that we ended up leaving Bellingham when I was 16. I was not a fan of that decision, but my mom was recruited by the University of Arizona to become the vice president of student affairs at the U of A. She had become that at Western. She kind of rose through the ranks. And so she went and interviewed. They loved her, offered her the job, and she said, you know what, I can only take this position if you offer a tenured professorship to my husband, Kit Taylor. And they agreed, and so we left the beautiful Pacific Northwest and ended up in the scorching desert of Tucson. And while I was definitely salty in the moment, it turned out to be extremely important for my own formation because it broke me out of my comfort zone. And my parents had instilled in me 2 really deep beliefs. The first is, and I didn't have the language for it then, but essentially the belief of Imago Dei, which is at the very heart of our Christian faith. The belief that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And the way they described it is that my diversity as a biracial black man was a strength and not a weakness. And in a deeper and a broader sense, our nation's growing racial and ethnic diversity was actually an incredible gift, an incredible strength. Now, you'll probably hear me tonight make a couple of different Marvel Universe references. My family's like huge into Marvel. Our dog is even named Marvel, actually. And so, in Marvel terms, I really believe that growing diversity is our superpower. But I'm going to switch to DC Comics in a second. Across our history, many have tried to convince us that it is actually a form of kryptonite. And I believe that those who believe that our growing diversity is to be feared and not celebrated have been a major part of how we have gotten to this current moment. Not the only reason, but it is one of those undercurrents. It's a fault line that we have been wrestling with as a nation from our inception. The other thing my parents instilled in me was a really strong belief that my generation, Generation X, now I am dating myself, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. And I took that really, really seriously, maybe even too seriously. I started reading every Taylor Branch book I could find. The Eyes on the Prize series came out when I was in high school. And I kind of grew up getting a little frustrated because I felt like I should have been coming to age at the height of the civil rights movement and been heavily involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, over time, I have realized that God brought me into the world for such a time as this, and that, yes, I think I am or was born at the right time. But they gave me this strong sense that this baton continues to get passed on to future generations. So much of my time here, from Lowell Elementary School to Fairhaven Middle School to 2 years at Seaholm, did mold and shape me, and I'm deeply grateful for that. In his final book, Dr. Martin Luther King asks this prescient question, and it is the title of the book: where do we go from here, chaos or community? And for tonight, I'm adding just one word into that book, my own remix. The question for tonight is, where do we go from here, chaos or beloved community? Just before he was assassinated in 1968, same year my parents got married, Dr. King sensed that our nation was at a dangerous crossroads as you witnessed the stall of the civil rights movement and the rise of rampant violence, including riots all across the country. The country was embroiled in the Vietnam War and was coming apart at the seams due to culture clashes, including a backlash against many of the gains of the civil rights movement and the beginning of what was called the Southern Strategy to try to exploit white grievance in reaction to the gains of the civil rights movement. Well, I believe that, again, we are at a dangerous crossroads moment. We see a new administration that has come into power seemingly bent on rolling back many of the advances, including the civil rights advances of the 20th and 21st century. A difficult yet well-established truth about our nation is that we have never fully lived up to the ideals of our nation's founding documents. When I wrote this book, I intentionally chose the iconic phrase from our preamble of the Constitution, "a more perfect union," because these words give the document its idyllic power. Some of you may not know the origin story behind those words, but it was an unsung founding father, and I'm not talking about Alexander Hamilton, as much as I love that musical, but the actual author of the preamble was a man from New York named Gouverneur Morris. And he literally led what was called the Committee of Style. It was like the first communications consultant of the United States. And that committee was charged with writing a set of words that would help elevate the Constitution in terms of ideals that could help unite 13 disparate colonies at the time. And so they wrote the words, "We the people," in order to form a more perfect union. Now, I think the beauty of the words is in the more. It is the constant striving of trying to become that more perfect union, because we know that our union was never perfect and will never be truly perfect, but that it is a striving for the more that enables us to become more perfect. Yes, I believe that, well, first, the future of our country has always been bitterly contested between an overly exclusive vision of our country that privileges whiteness and maleness and straightness and ability. And now even a certain brand, I would call a distorted brand of Christianity that many of us refer to as Christian nationalism. And on the other hand, a more inclusive future that believes in equally valuing all of God's children. I believe that we are facing an inflection point where our country is as bitterly divided as it's been in a very long time, as we contest between the stark choice between this kind of Christian nationalist vision and a kind of MAGA vision that ultimately is willing to embrace a strong man in order to maintain and impose their will and power on the rest of the country. And the alternative to that, which is a more inclusive, a more just, multiracial, multi-religious democracy, where everyone is able to thrive, no exceptions. That vision, that alternative vision, is what so many of us refer to as the beloved community. I wrote this book in kind of the vision for it came about after the 2016 election. And I'm just going to take you back there for a second. I know many of us don't want to travel necessarily in our minds to that moment. But the morning after the election, my son, Joshua, who is now 14, was 5 years old at the time. And he literally came into our room with this anguished look on his face at 3 a.m. And my wife and I had a really restless sleep. And he was like, "Mommy and Daddy, I really need to know who won the election." And, I'm a preacher, so it's pretty rare that I'm speechless. But I was speechless in that moment. I didn't know how to respond to my son. And I was still kind of processing it myself. And then he said, "Well, I don't understand how someone who has said and done such mean things could win." And his 5-year-old mind had boiled down essentially why I felt such anguish. It wasn't because a Republican won. It wasn't because someone more conservative than I am won. It was because someone won by stoking, exploiting many of the worst ills in our body politic. The ill of racism, the ill of misogyny, the ill of xenophobia. And that he won not in spite of those things, but for some because of those things. And so, fast forward a number of years, and in the lead up to the 2020 election, I was kind of trying to make sense of how we got to this moment. And part of the goal of this book is to try to make some sense of that. And one piece of that is that I think we are severely divided in part because we have such dramatically different understandings of who we the people is and who it should include. And we have such different understandings of our nation's history. And that nation's history is now more embattled than it has been for a very, very long time. I kind of joke that if this book had sold much more copies, it would now be banned at the Naval Academy. Because, literally books by Jim Wallace, who was my predecessor, are literally now banned at the Naval Academy as well as other academic institutions around the country. I believed as we approached the 2020 election that we had an opportunity to create a kind of fourth founding of this nation. First founding was 1776. We're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of that this next year. Second founding was the end of the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction. And the third founding was the victories of the Civil Rights Movement, the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But each of those foundings experienced a counter-movement of backlash that helped to unravel much of the progress that was made. Well, I thought that the kind of death rattle of the MAGA movement was January 6th, that would be the searing wake-up call for our nation, where we would want to put behind us so much of what we'd experienced, and we want to reach toward this ongoing vision of becoming an inclusive, just, multiracial democracy. Now, call me naive, call me overly optimistic or idealistic. That is not the way things turned out, as we know. I underestimated the degree to which the big lie would metastasize into the body politic. I had hoped that lessons from the pandemic would inspire a greater commitment to build a more equitable economy. Yet that backlash against shutdowns and vaccines seemingly exacerbated our culture wars and our selfish individualism. I underestimated the religious right's unscrupulous thirst for power and the extent to which Christian nationalism had become woven into the fabric of so many of our churches across this country. I didn't realize that this 50-year movement in the making had built an incredible degree of infrastructure, funded in large part by billionaires like the DeVosses and the Koch brothers, but also oil billionaires and tech billionaires that have poured hundreds of millions of dollars in order to build up a Christian nationalist infrastructure that has been quite successful in swaying Christians to what I would argue is a kind of heretical form of our faith. But I didn't come here to depress you. And before we get to the hope in this message, it is important that we resist the temptation to make what is happening solely, or even in some cases primarily, about the current president. The truth is, what we are facing right now is about far more than a single president or even a single MAGA movement. It is a deeper rooted struggle, a tug-of-war that again has been taking place throughout our nation's history, and I think it's important for us to understand this long arc of history that we sit within. One thing I recognized then that remains true now is this, and this is some good news. The majority of Americans still believe in pluralism. They still believe in the ideal of liberty and justice for all. And I know this because when I have the opportunity to speak all around the country, I see nodding heads. And I know that's anecdotal. But it is also backed up by a great deal of polling that shows that most Americans do still support the principles and ideals of fairness, of equal justice under the law, of due process, and of the rights and freedoms that are outlined in our nation's Constitution. Now, if you walk from the Sojourners office, where we're headquartered in D.C., literally about 4 blocks from Union Station, just blocks away from the U.S. Capitol. And when I take the metro in, I literally have to walk right by the headquarters of the Heritage Foundation. A little sobering. And this past week, as you know, there's been a lot, well, I guess now 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of reflection about the first 100 days of the Trump administration. Now, the Heritage Foundation, who helped, basically create Project 2025, which has become the blueprint for this administration, despite President Trump, when he was a candidate, trying to distance himself from it, literally most of what they are doing now is directly tied into the policy blueprint that you can find in Project 2025. They have this gigantic poster of Trump on their building, about 30 feet tall. And it is celebrating his accomplishments, I put that in air quotes, of his first 100 days, right? And there's a whole list of accomplishments, including dismantling the administrative state and removing government waste. Now, despite estimates from the Partnership for Public Service that have found that the firings, the chaos, the rehirings, the lost productivity, and the paid leave our government has had to pay thousands of workers that have been fired unfairly, has cost us, the taxpayers, upwards of $135 billion already. This is roughly equal to the $150 billion that the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, at least for now, has promised to find in savings. And in reality, they have arguably only found about $10 billion in quote-unquote savings. Now, there was plenty of coverage of what Trump and his administration had done in their first 100 days. In the conservative media ecosystem, this coverage appeared as a disinformation-riddled praise for how Trump had restored America's greatness and created new prosperity for everyone. In mainstream media outlets, the coverage focused on cataloging the harms of policies that often have felt chaotic or cruel or both. And this week, as the attention of so many of us have been fixated on the conclave, where a new pope has been chosen, Pope Leo, I felt particularly hopeful about this, what they call the Latin Yankee Pope, that's his nickname, at least for now, that Pope Leo might be for our country what Pope John Paul was for Poland in supporting the solidarity movement and helping to bring down authoritarian-style government in Poland. By his team's own admission, the Trump administration has used a strategy of shock and awe and flood the zone with over 100 executive orders and policy decisions, as well as attention-grabbing stunts and social media posts. Now, I'll admit that the sheer volume of these actions, again, ranging from the cruel to the immoral to the outrageous, has often left me feeling unsure about how best to respond. Pardoning January 6 rioters, revoking security clearances of his critics, ending government DEI programs, proclaiming that there are only two genders, ending the policy barring ICE from conducting immigration raids at schools and at churches, withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization, and attempting to end birthright citizenship. That was just Inauguration Day. And of course, we have seen an onslaught ever since that have literally stretched our democratic norms and in many cases been an abuse of executive power itself. I am, in this moment, reminded of the timeless words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. But they must take it because conscience tells them it is right. Based on recent polling and a wave of protests across the country, it is increasingly clear that this administration's overreach and abuse of power in its first 100 days is neither expedient nor is it good politics. According to recent polls, many of which you probably saw, the president is increasingly underwater, even on issues like immigration and the economy. PRI, which is a very reputable polling firm, released results 2 weeks ago that provide clear evidence that most Americans want to rein in President Trump's overreach, stop his undermining of democratic norms, and protect our system of checks and balances. And to me, that is some good news. But the bad news is that we have seen another co-equal branch of government, namely our Congress, our elected representatives, by and large abdicate their responsibilities as a check and balance, as the holders of the power of the purse with this new administration. This is a moment where we need, yes, the courts to play their role, and some of them are, but that is going to take a long time, and the courts don't typically have the power to enforce their rulings. We need to demand courage from the Republican-controlled Congress. Now, in my Black Baptist tradition, we believe in something called call and response. And so I want to invite you into that tradition tonight. We're going to practice it together, okay? And I'm not trying to force you to do anything. You know, I should have mentioned earlier that my pastor has this great line that he often shares before he is giving a talk or a sermon that he knows might be a little controversial. He says, my job as your pastor, and I'm not your pastor, but my job tonight is not to convince you to think exactly how I think. My hope and my job is to try to get you to think more critically and more theologically about the very things that break God's heart and the very things that are at the center of God's kingdom. So that is my goal tonight. So if you resonate or you want to respond to what I'm about to say, then I want you to say in response, no, it's time for moral courage, okay? Here we go. Beloved, is it right to freeze congressionally authorized funding for global programs that fight hunger, disease, and extreme poverty around the world? No, it's time for moral courage. Is it right to round up and deport immigrants and green card holders, including Mr. Kilmar Obrega Garcia, without due process and send them to a mass security prison in El Salvador? No, it is time for moral courage. Is it right to coerce law firms and universities to pledge loyalty to the ideological whims of this administration? No, it is time for moral courage. Is it right to fire thousands of skilled and dedicated federal employees while ignoring federal government labor protections. No, it is time for moral courage. Is it right to impose reckless tariffs on countries across the world that will ultimately harm the most vulnerable and have already dramatically increased the likelihood of a recession? No, it is time for moral courage. Is it right to cut funding for programs that feed the hungry and care for the sick in places like Bellingham, all so that we can extend tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and corporations? No, it is time for moral courage. Yes, it is time for moral courage. Because not only are these actions and policies I just named not right, they also threaten our fundamental freedoms and, in many cases, are fundamentally unconstitutional. So yes, chaos and cruelty is, of course, a core feature of the governing style of this current administration. It is not simply a glitch, and it can be overwhelming. We know that these actions have dire and far-reaching consequences. We saw aid organizations, schools, state governments, hospitals, nonprofits, all in turmoil as they've been trying to figure out what to do when their funding was frozen or their staffs were cut. We see the fear in members of migrant and LGBTQ plus communities. And so yes, resisting the urge to panic in this moment is real, and it is hard. But here's the thing. Provoking a sense of disorientation, of paralysis, of numbness, of fear, even of despair, is exactly the goal of the flood the zone strategy. We know that authoritarian governments around the world, in Hungary, formerly in Brazil and in Russia and elsewhere, have thrived on people feeling a sense of despair and despondency. The Trump administration hopes to exploit a demoralized and overwhelmed opposition to quickly accomplish as much as they can as quickly as possible. But we, as people of faith, must respond in a different way. Because our faith reminds us that there is no earthly regime or government that has the final word. Our faith points us to a great cloud of witnesses that is literally cheering us on as we continue to push forward the cause of righteousness, of justice, and of steadfast love. We are the ones that are called to help co-create beloved community in our midst. These and so many other reminders of our faith can anchor us in hope, can reinforce our resilience. And so yes, beloved, it is time to lean into our faith in this moment, because I believe our faith is built for moments like this. Beneath the dire and alarming headlines, there is another set of stories that don't get nearly as much attention. Stories of people who have been courageously taking action to counter the administration's harms. And these stories are growing in prominence, and I want to share just a few. Now, many of you might have participated in the hands-off protests that happened just a number of weeks ago. Grateful for those and other protests. But there has also been an uptick in courage and activism within communities of faith. Building and strengthening a big pro-tent democracy movement will require many kinds of efforts. Now, I want to share with you a framework that has been incredibly inspirational for me. It is one that an organization we work with closely that works to kind of resist authoritarian governments around the world, called the Horizons Project, has really helped to sharpen. And it is centered around three commitments that I actually think are rooted in our faith. The first is to block anti-democratic practices. The second is to bridge across the chasm of our differences, ideological differences, educational differences, rural-urban differences, and more, racial differences. And the third is to build strong and resilient institutions that can help to strengthen our democracy. Now, these are often overlapping and mutually reinforcing. And so we shouldn't rely on or get stuck in just one of them. We need all of them. And while we desperately need a lot more courageous resistance or blocking, we can't simply be defined on only around what we are against. We also have to be bold and crystal clear about what we are for. How are we going to replace the brokenness, the harm of what is, with the possibility and hope of what can be? As a Christian, I believe that the block, bridge, build framework is reminiscent of the Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 12, when he offers what I think is one of the most powerful metaphors in all of Scripture, where he compares the health of the church to the health of our human body. And I think that same metaphor doesn't just apply to the church, it also applies to Bellingham, it applies to the state of Washington, it applies to our nation as a whole. And the apostle, who is speaking to a church that is riddled with conflict and feuding and bickering, he says to them that their parts really are like the parts of a body. And when one part suffers, then all parts suffer with it. He also goes further and says that those parts should have equal concern for one another, and that in actuality, we should have the most concern for the weakest parts of our body, right? It is a moral blueprint for how we are called to respond in this moment, how we are supposed to be putting our faith into action. Our faith does provide the impetus for all three of these, and I just want to quickly describe each and some of the things that are happening literally as we speak. So first is this commitment to block. Organizers define blocking as resisting threats to our freedoms and democratic values and protecting those who are most harmed in our midst. It's the kind of action that Jesus talked about in Matthew 25, when he said that whatever we do to help or to hurt those that are homeless or hungry or living in poverty, we are literally doing unto Jesus himself. And to take it a little further, I get frustrated when I feel like we overly sanitize Jesus and forget that he had some radical moments in his ministry, including after he enters into Jerusalem on a donkey. Where does he go? He goes into the temple, and he sees merchants selling doves at exorbitant prices. He sees merchants charging very high interest, and he gets mad because the temple is being defiled and people are being exploited. And so what does he do? He shuts down the temple, he closes the gates, and he overturns the tables of the money changers. And so yes, blocking is a part of what it means to follow Jesus. Some ways that communities of faith are already blocking include a series of vigils that Sojourners has been organizing with 29 other denominations and faith-based organizations. I'm so grateful the United Church of Christ has been a formal co-sponsor of these. The Methodist Church has, the Lutheran Church has, the Episcopal Church has. We together as faith leaders have been gathering outside the steps of the Capitol, U.S. Capitol, every Wednesday at noon to provide a faithful witness calling on Congress to do its job, to literally reclaim its Article I powers, and to prevent the abuse and overreach of power by the Trump administration. Now, it's a call that transcends partisanship, because this isn't about left or right or Democrats or Republicans. This is about literally Congress allowing itself to become obsolete by giving its power away to the consolidation of power by the current executive. It's been encouraging to see these grow in momentum, and literally this last Wednesday, not only did we gather and we spoke and we prayed, but then we delivered a letter that had been signed by over 21 different denominations to all of the leadership of Congress, literally spelling out what kind of courage we want them to show in this particular moment. Thank you. Amen. Many of you may be familiar with Reverend William Barber, who started the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina and is one of the leaders of the modern-day Poor People's Campaign. Well, he was arrested with two other faith leaders who prayed in the Capitol Rotunda this last week after holding a rally to sound the alarm on the immoral budget cuts that are being pursued in Washington, D.C. against the poor, children, women, and families. A large coalition of organizations and denominations are organizing a major march, a moral march, in the season of Pentecost on June 10th. Invite you to come out. I know it's a long way, but we'd love to have you. But we are going to be surrounding the Capitol with faithful voices, calling on Congress to reject what is fundamentally an immoral budget that is currently being negotiated in Congress. Houses of worship have learned practical ways to get their congregations to get involved in protecting migrants, including supporting those who are being targeted by deportation. A number of faith-based groups, including my predecessor at Georgetown, Jim Wallace, and the Center for Faith and Justice, literally banded together and have sued the administration over its change in policy that is now allowing ICE to conduct raids in houses of worship and in other sensitive locations. Communities of faith are increasingly blocking in courageous ways, and I believe that those need to multiply and be amplified in this moment. The second is to bridge. Bridging involves building relationships and engaging in brave dialogue across cultural, educational, and ideological differences, including with people we may fiercely disagree with. Now, for some of us, bridging is a lot more difficult than blocking. Just being real. Because this kind of work, which often has to be rooted in a deep curiosity and a commitment to listening, is akin to what the Apostle Paul speaks to in 2 Corinthians 5:11 when he says, "Since then we know what it is to fear the Lord, we must try to persuade others." Yes, this is challenging work, especially in a time when toxic polarization is impacting every aspect of our society, including the church. But we must always prioritize, while we must always prioritize our own safety, bridge building recognizes that our ultimate aim is a ministry of reconciliation. It is a work that requires us to build relationships and invite others into God's transformative work around us. There are many hopeful bridge-building efforts that are taking place as we speak. Sojourners helped to create a framework called a call to civic discipleship that is trying to help model for Christians what a healthier form of Christian civic engagement can look like, that rejects this false notion that we should be weaponizing our faith to support one partisan or ideological agenda, that somehow the flag should be waving the cross. But on the other hand, we also reject this notion that our faith has nothing to do with politics, that we can just bury our heads in the sand and hope that it won't impact our congregation. Well, following Jesus has profound social, political, and economic implications. And we need to find and to show a third way of how we can be salt and light in the midst of our politics. Sojo Action is hosting a series of webinars that are helping faith leaders help to bridge divides within their congregations, and we're developing a whole series of tools and resources to help them. A multi-faith movement called the One America Movement is also doing a great deal to reduce polarization and unite faith leaders from different walks of life and different political perspectives to work together to address and solve common problems. There are many examples I could point to. And even as we prophetically expose hypocrisy and the harms that many of this administration's policies are causing to vulnerable communities, we must always, always resist the temptation to hold contempt for Americans and other Christians who continue to support the president or his agenda. Jesus calls us to a higher calling of loving our enemies and casting out fear with perfect love. Lastly, we must build. Building is both about casting an alternative vision for the future we are seeking to co-create, and it's taking day-to-day actions that help us live into that vision. When we build, we boldly take steps to enact a moral vision that is rooted in God's reign of righteousness, justice, and steadfast love. Everywhere we look, we can find people of faith who are trying to work toward a better, stronger, and more resilient democracy where everyone can thrive. Sojourners, after the election, started something called the Truth in Action Roundup, which is a newsletter that is going out that literally tries to cut through all the noise and provide a really succinct summary of the most important things we think you should know about what's happening in this moment in our politics. And then we provide some actionable things you can do to join others in building or in blocking and bridging. And then the most popular section is called Breathe. We literally are offering inspiration, spiritual sustenance. And one thing that's been really encouraging is that we have seen over 5,000 faith leaders sign up for this e-newsletter. And 60% of them open it and read it each and every week that they receive it, which if you know the publications world, it is kind of unheard of to have an open rate that high. And so clearly there's a thirst out there for good, accurate information, for ideas on how you can take action, and for spiritual sustenance and strength. Protect Democracy has created a toolkit for faith organizations and houses of worship on how to organize and train faith communities for collective action. Now, ultimately, I believe that in addition to the building of institutions and stronger churches, more resilient churches, we also have to cast this bold alternative vision. And as you have heard and as you can imagine, the vision that I'm most drawn to is the vision that literally animated the civil rights movement. When Dr. King had his first major victory in Montgomery, he gave a speech where he said that the end goal of the civil rights movement was redemption. The end goal was reconciliation. The end goal was the creation of the beloved community. For him, that was the North Star. And the beloved community was about a commitment to equality. It was about a commitment to nonviolence. It was about a commitment to agape love, a kind of selfless, unconditional love. And so I have tried to build on Dr. King's understanding of the beloved community, as well as Ella Baker's and Fannie Lou Hamer's and so many other leaders. And I've created my own succinct 21st century definition. You ready for it? The beloved community is about building a Bellingham, a nation where neither punishment nor privilege is tied to race or ethnicity, to gender, to religion, to ableness, to sexuality or sexual orientation. It is about building a Bellingham, a nation where everyone is equally valued, where everyone is respected, and where everyone is enabled to thrive, right? I know, yeah, thank you. Amen. I know that that is a big vision, right? But we need a big, bold, unifying vision in this moment. And one of the things I love about it, and this is like the Kennedy School nerd in me that's coming out, it is extremely measurable. We can measure whether any policy decision, budget decision, law either exacerbates the ways in which so often privilege and punishment has been and continues to be tied to these different parts of our identity, or we can measure whether it actually helps to unravel that. Americans don't want to have a society where punishment and privilege is automatically tied to those core parts of who we are. And so I do think it is a powerful vision. And one of the things I love about it is it's a vision that isn't just a Christian vision. It resonates with the Jewish understanding of tikkun olam, to repair and heal our society. It is rooted in a Muslim vision of human dignity and equality. It is rooted in a humanistic vision. And it's not a vision that is stuck in the broken categories or labels of left and right, red and blue. I believe it's a vision that takes us deeper than those broken labels and categories. Now, in my book, A More Perfect Union, I not only talk about this big vision, I break it down and I describe what I call the Beatitudes, yes, borrowing from Jesus, of the beloved community. And they include a commitment to what I describe as Imago Dei equality, Ubuntu interdependence, environmental stewardship, dignity for all, nonviolence, and I think I named them all. And I'm more than happy to talk about any of those when we have a chance to engage in some conversation. But I want to end with this. This is a season where I believe some of us do need to give more generously, to shore up organizations that are working to resist and to build in this moment. This is a moment where we must give of our time and talent to offer aid to those who are most vulnerable. And I'm grateful that the churches that are co-sponsoring this are already doing that in a lot of ways. This is a time where we, yes, need to build deeper relationships and break out of our comfort zones to do some of that bridging work, which I know is uncomfortable and can be really hard. But the beauty is each of us can contribute in ways that we are most equipped and called to do so. But we have to do it in a more sacrificial and courageous way, because sacrifice and courage are contagious. And we have to see those things multiply in this moment. We've already seen ways in which the current administration has already stumbled due to some of its own internal divisions and because of some of its own overreach. And I believe that these failures, compounded by their incompetence and by their increasing corruption, are ultimately going to help lead to their downfall. But we can't just sit on the sidelines and watch this thing happen. This is not a movie. This is not a reality television show. This is our lives. This is our faith that is being tested and stretched in this moment. And so, I believe that the project of pushing our nation further up to that mountaintop of becoming a just, more inclusive, multiracial democracy is steeper and it's longer than I had hoped for. But I'm convinced that despite the setbacks, we must keep climbing. We must keep pushing. We must keep ascending together. We can be reminded and encouraged by the words of the Apostle Paul. Galatians 6:9, let us not be weary in doing good, because in due season we will reap a good harvest if we do not give up. Beloved, let us practice resistance by refusing to tune out, by refusing to become demoralized in this moment, and by remembering that we serve a God who promises to make all things new. We serve a God that is greater in us than we can ever be in this world. We serve a God who promises to make us more than conquerors over even the most invincible Goliaths in our midst. I believe that now is the time to remake and transform our faith communities, to be that salt and light, to help build a beloved community by, yes, blocking, yes, by bridging, and by building. And here is the greatest news of all, that building the beloved community is not just about the struggle. And yes, there will be struggle. It is as much about the journey as it is the destination and the preferred future that we are trying to create together. There is joy. There is wholeness. There is connection and community and solidarity when we join together with courage to build the beloved community. So let us journey together. Let us sojourn together as we block, as we bridge, as we build. Let us reject the false choice of chaos, and let us embrace the choice of the beloved community. Amen. Thank you. I forgot that part.
Oh, thank you, Reverend Taylor. Thank you. Great sermon. Amen. Yes. One of our volunteers, Sharon Camblin, is here to give us some instructions, and I'm going to have her do that so she can tell you what we're going to do next.
You're welcome.
You okay with having people do the cards?
Yeah, that's fine.
So we're changing up the order of things a little bit. Adam has been very generous and has agreed to do a question and an answer. And the way that we would like to generate the questions is that you have a white card. If you will write your one question per card, you can have as many cards as you want. If you will pass those to the end of the row to your left, we will have people quickly pick those up. Reverend Sharon Benton has the first question. But while you're writing your questions and we're picking those up in the left-hand aisle, we have 3 people that are going to be picking those up. Want to invite you to 2 things. We have refreshments at the end of the question and the answer in our social hall. We invite you to come and enjoy both cookies and savories. The other thing I would like you to do is to mark Tuesday, June 3rd on your calendars to continue this conversation about moving to a beloved community here in Bellingham. We have a group in this congregation called Exploring Your Faith, and we would like to invite all of you to a conversation that evening about what we can continue to do to each other, with each other. You'll find that in your church bulletins as we move forward before June 3rd. So if you will, we'll give you 3 minutes, and believe me, I was a principal, I can count. So 3 minutes, hold up your cards. The people in the aisles will pick those up. We'll give Sharon Benton just another moment, and then we'll sort those. Thank you.
Do you have time when you're going to do this?
Probably as we go into the reception.
Okay.
Something we do if
All right, then I won't do that now.
Okay. I mean, will you tell me what you think would be better?
No, that's great.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so my first question is really easy. Would you please repeat your definition of beloved community? Because I started writing it down, and I really want that. I don't know if anybody else was trying to capture that, but I saw some pens trying to go very quickly.
Absolutely. Okay, so my definition, my remix, if you will, of building the beloved community is creating a community, Bellingham, a nation, where neither punishment nor privilege is viciously attached to race, to ethnicity, to gender, to religion, to sexual orientation, to ableness. Sorry. No, it's okay. Race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ableness. And it's to build a society where everyone is equally valued, everyone is respected, and everyone is enabled to thrive. Yeah?
You want to read the question yourself, or would you like
why don't you read them? Yeah.
All right. Can you please provide one action from a recent Truth in Action newsletter?
Yes. I know sometimes these can kind of feel a little bit performative, but like how many of you have ever signed an action alert from an organization, right? Okay. So believe it or not, congressional offices do count those. And, you know, if there's a couple of hundred of them, they're probably not going to make a dent. But when you start getting into the thousands, they really do pay attention. And so we, in addition to delivering this letter that was signed by 21 different denominations and faith-based organizations to Speaker Johnson and Majority Leader Thune and pretty much all the leaders on both sides of the aisle, we also did an action alert where people could literally just add their name and then send that petition. And we had over 10,000 people around the country that joined us in that. And so I would like to, times that by 10. I want to get more like 100,000 people that are joining us in these kind of actions. But it has enabled us to do a number of follow-up visits with many of these congressional offices. And so that was one of the actions that was this last week.
What is something a young person can do in their daily life to contribute to building a beloved community?
So one of the things that I learned early on, and I'm glad that I was able to learn this, is just how heroic and how central young people were for the civil rights movement. I didn't mention this, but if you do have a chance to get a copy of my book, the paperback just came out this last month, but one of the most humbling things that has ever happened in my life is when my publisher, Broadleaf, asked me who I wanted to write the foreword, I immediately thought of Congressman John Lewis, because he just embodied the beloved community his whole life, and almost sacrificed his life to help create it. And so I had gotten to know him a little bit over the course of my career, and I called up his chief of staff, and I was like, I have a really big ask, and I didn't realize at that time that he was already in hospice care. And so his chief of staff was like, look, I think he would normally love to have done this, but it's probably not going to happen. So I just kind of let it go and started thinking about who else I might want to have asked to write the foreword. But something in my spirit was like, I just couldn't get to a place of asking someone else. And then Congressman Lewis passed away. And literally the next day, his chief of staff texted me and said that Congressman Lewis had reviewed and written the foreword and had approved it, and it's literally in the book. I don't know this for certain, but I'm pretty confident it's one of the last things that he wrote. And so it just, really, brings me to tears. So I'm sharing that because, like, John Lewis, as a young person, showed the kind of things you can do. I think this is a moment when it is really important for you to get involved in some of the demonstrations that are happening around us. I think it's really important for you to start reading more about the fullness of our history. Some of these books that are being banned, sadly. I think this is a really important moment for you to serve and to help some of those communities that are being harmed and left behind as a result of many of the harmful policies of this administration and Congress. And so, volunteerism, activism, this is a time to really lean into those things. And I've always believed that young people can be and should be on the cutting edge of social change. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see more of that. And I think we saw kind of a surge of that during the kind of racial awakening summer of 2020. A lot of young people were kind of leading the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think we really need it right now in the context of not just defending our democracy, but ultimately strengthening and transforming it. Yeah, sure.
Okay. What are some novel and effective ideas that smaller congregations can employ that bridge, build, or block?
Yeah. So on the blocking side, I recognize that, I don't know every detail about your member of Congress, but I would guess that they are probably providing some opposition to what is happening. But this isn't just about Congress. This is also about what is happening here locally and what the state government is doing to fill some of these gaps and what your local government is doing. So I do think it's an important moment for congregations to find ways to build more agency and power. And there's various ways to do that. You can certainly do that in some cases through some of the networks that exist, like Faith in Action and Gamaliel. I don't know the Bellingham landscape as well, so I don't know if any of those are active here. Sojourners is also providing a lot of tools and training for church leaders on how to develop more of a kind of public theology and more organizing skills. Unfortunately, these are not the things that we learned in seminary, and yet I think they're extremely important, right? So that's kind of one piece. On the bridging part, I think there are organizations that are helping to equip people to do this work. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the organization called Braver Angels. So they are bringing together people from different political points of view and creating a space for real civil dialogue. And I think they've done some really good work. I mentioned this organization, the One America Movement, that is doing that within multi-faith communities. So I think there's some really good tools out there that you can use. And then some of this is within your own spheres of influence, your own relationships. I would imagine all of us have at least one family member, one friend, one former classmate that may be swayed by the kind of MAGA vision and that kind of ideology. And so, again, I know it's hard, but I think there's been too much kind of canceling and detaching ourselves from those people rather than really trying to lean in and see how we can repair and and bridge some of those differences.
We're going to do 2 more questions, if that's okay, Reverend Taylor?
That is fine.
How does protesting in streets across the country make any difference?
Yeah. So I don't want to pretend or, kind of argue that one weekend of protests is going to make a sea change in our current politics. That being said, though, I think a constant drumbeat of public opposition and dissent that is peaceful, that is strongly tied to a vision, a positive vision, will make a major difference, and probably already has made a major difference. I think there's a number of reasons why the president's approval ratings have finally started to crumble. And they're not as low as maybe I might have expected, but they have significantly dropped. And that is in part because of the overreach on things like tariffs and people starting to feel these decisions hit their pocketbook. But it's also because I think they're seeing people that are offering an alternative, that they are, engaging in protest in a way that is starting to break through. And these are not just in the big cities, as you know. I mean, one of the great things about the most recent wave of protests is they've been in small towns around the country, rural places, and the big cities. And so I think that's really, really important. And I also think we just need to become even more kind of creative and resourceful about how we are organizing some of these protests. And again, the kind of visible protests are important, but so are some of the more kind of behind the scenes protests that are taking place as well.
Thank you. There are so many great questions here. I'm sorry we're not going to reach them all tonight, but these will also be part of that June 3rd evening that Sharon mentioned. Where are the emerging voices or new leaders found in people of faith in our country? Or in any place?
There are quite a few. I've become increasingly convinced that the kind of era of the Dr. Kings is behind us. It's not to say that some of us might not emulate some of what, his charisma and his brilliance, if you will, but I think we're just in a very different moment because of social media, because of a lot of different factors. And so what we really need is a lot more, I think, local, courageous faith leaders that are able to offer that kind of moral witness boldly in their particular context and do it in concert with others, because that, one, is going to break through in the Bellingham Herald, if it still exists. I hope it does. Maybe. Kind of. Okay, got it. But it's likely to get more attention here, and if that is happening around the country, then that becomes a national storyline that I think is really powerful. There are some really inspirational national voices. Certainly I mentioned Reverend William Barber is one. I am a big fan of Otis Moss III, who is the current pastor of Trinity Church in Chicago. My own pastor, Dr. Howard John Wesley, is a really prophetic voice in these times. I think grateful that she's a personal friend. Bishop Marianne Buddy showed incredible courage in the sermon that she gave on unity, and then at the end made a plea for mercy. And so, there are some really amazing voices. But one of the things that's frustrating is that, and this goes back to a point I made earlier, let me just, I know I'm sorry I probably already spoke too long, but this is a really important thing for all of us to understand. So this goes back to so many misnomers about our history, right? Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Well, the opposite of truth, of lies and disinformation, keep us captive, right? So most people think that the religious right as a movement was started after the passage of Roe v. Wade, or the Roe v. Wade decision, and in response to abortion, which is completely false. The religious right as a movement literally started earlier than that, and it was a political creation of the political right. It was a political operative, a Catholic one named Paul Weyrich, who formed a deal with Jerry Falwell, and they wanted to convert Southern white Christians in particular into a loyal constituency voting bloc for the Republican Party. And the first issue that they focused on was not abortion, it was the desegregation of Christian colleges and schools because of the 1964 Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. And so the religious right literally not only, kind of got co-opted into the Republican Party, it had very racist roots that I think have poisoned that movement from the beginning, and explain at least in part how that then morphed into a Christian nationalist movement that is heavily associated with racism and misogyny and patriarchy, and that there were new deals that were made in the 1990s and in the 2000s where the DeVosses and the Koch brothers and oil billionaires and others poured hundreds of millions of dollars to create the Family Research Council, to help create and fund Turning Point USA. And so while this was happening, many of our churches, Mainline included, started to experience contraction. And some of our churches have been struggling. And there's been, sadly, some atrophy. And so there's been this kind of lopsided landscape, if you will. Then, to make matters worse, from my perspective, the Democratic Party increasingly became a party of, at times, hostile secularism. Mm-hmm. And I don't want a Democratic Party that is sectarian. Let me be crystal clear about that. But why would you cede faith to the other party when the majority of Democrats are also people of faith? That forms who we are. It shapes our values and why we care about what we care about, right? We had the most Catholic president, in my opinion, devout Catholic president in our nation's history in Joe Biden. Did you ever see pictures of him coming out of Mass? Went to Mass every weekend. Did he really ever talk about Catholic social teaching and how that inspires him to want to fight for parental leave and childcare for every person? So I really think that the combination of a party becoming reticent and hostile toward faith, another party thinking they own faith in God, which is absolutely ridiculous, and then this lopsided playing field where the right has been hyper-funded and supercharged, and those of us that are, I don't really like to call us a religious left, I think we're really the justice-committed Christians, we have been struggling. Yeah. And so this is the moment for that to all change. This is a moment where we need to lean into our faith, and I really believe that if we do that, it will not only help to rehabilitate the tarnished reputation of the church and help further the cause of the Great Commission that evangelical Christians say they care about so much, and it's going to be essential for how we not only defend but transform our democracy. And so, maybe this is my segue into, hey, I would love your support for Sojourners, right? I'll be, bold about that, but also for other faith-based organizations that are doing this work of justice in this time, because we've got to find a way to strengthen that work, which I think could ultimately be the antidote and the bulwark against what we're seeing right now. Yeah. Sorry, I went on my little
Wonderful.
Commercial there. But
yeah. So before we head in for snacks and continued conversation, I'm going to ask you, Reverend Taylor, how can we support the work of Sojourners?
Absolutely. So, one, you can subscribe to our magazine. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter called Soja Mail. You'll get an article column that I usually write about every other week, and then other authors also write those. You can make a donation to our work. I'm not sure if they're well, yes, there are cards outside. You probably know this better than I. You want to mention how that can work?
Everybody's taller. There are two ways to do. There's a gentleman with an orange, kind of a burnt sweater on. He has a basket if you'd like to donate this evening. There are also a number of QR codes if you want to donate through a card, so that you can just click on that. They're posted in a number of places in the building so that that's available to you immediately.
Wonderful. And honestly, generally grateful for whatever support you can provide. And I mean, I do hope that you'll check out my book. It goes into a lot more detail than I could give tonight. In particular, like really drilling into what these Beatitudes are, what they look like. And ultimately, what I try to do is like highlight so many of the inspiring things that are happening that, again, don't get the headlines. But there is like this underground movement of building the beloved community that's really happening. Do you mind if I should close with one more quote? And you can tell that I'm certainly a big fan of Dr. King. But one of the things that I regret is that we often don't listen or read enough of his sermons. Like, at his core, he was a Black Baptist preacher. And, his speeches are amazing. Those are great. His books are great. But I think you get the true King in his sermons. And there's a book, an anthology of his sermons called Strength to Love that I highly recommend. And in that, in one of his sermons, he's preaching based on Romans 12. Be ye not conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And he does a remix of that text. And that's what I'm going to close with tonight. He says, the saving of our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority. Right? And I mean, I love it. I mean, that is what our faith is about. We're supposed to be creatively maladjusted, right? To the brokenness and the injustice around us. But it's not just about a different mindset. We then take that mindset, we put it into action, and we become that transformed, non-conforming minority. It's similar to the Margaret Mead quote about it's always a small committed minority that changes things, right? So yes, we may feel like a minority, even though oftentimes we're actually the majority. If you actually add up all the ones of us that are Christian that also care about justice, I think we are in the majority. But if we don't get louder, we don't get bolder, we don't get more courageous, we are going to see a lot of harm that could have been prevented. And on with this, our democracy is fragile, and it is not a given. We could end up losing it. And so this is a time not to defend democracy as this esoteric thing. I'm talking about the core freedoms that make us who we are. And by doing that, we could then usher in this fourth founding where we could actually become the we the people that is rooted in our faith values and in our civic values, where again, everyone is enabled to thrive and everyone is included in that we. Amen.
You bring us so much hope. Friends, part of being beloved community means that we break bread together. So come and eat in the social hall. Thank you, Reverend Taylor.
Thank you.